and it's going well, although it's been very late compared to previous years. Buyers of kernels still on the sidelines, still waiting, looking. That's not at all surprising for November. It may well continue until January. People are looking for an opportunity. They see relatively stable prices. There's nothing really to drag buyers into the market other than the calendar. And of course, that will eventually come. But if we get to January and people are still watching, then they may be tempted to wait and have a look and see how the Northern Hemisphere crop starts, especially in Cambodia and West Africa. US tariffs are gone. No surprise, really. No surprise that the US has removed its tariffs on most of those foods which are not grown in the US. All they were doing was hurting American consumers. They're gone. Who knows what the future holds in that respect? We've seen surprising developments this year, but for now, maybe there's some encouragement in the market by the removal of those tariffs. Meantime, the up and coming market, China, it's surprising to talk about China as up and coming, really, but it is booming. Shipments of cashew nuts to the Chinese market continue to surprise all of us in terms of their volume during 2025. It'd be interesting to see if that consolidates next year. West Africa, and now we're getting into the realm of a little bit of crystal ball gazing, but the West African crop's initial outlook weather-wise starts to look good. I've heard one or two people on the ground say that the crop looks a little bit earlier than normal, which is not necessarily accurate at this moment in time, but it is a good indicator. Weather-wise, we're okay, no problems to look at just now. At Cambodia, maybe there are a few weather questions in Cambodia. I'll have a brief look at the development in Cambodia later on. Maybe there are some questions. Maybe there are one or two questions there over the coming weeks. And we'll get on to policy in West Africa, particularly towards the end of this session. Relatively stable market environment. RCN price is a little bit stronger. Kernel's price is relatively steady. Interesting developments, some of them unexpected. They do give rise to a series of questions, or they cause me to ask a series of questions, such as, will the Tanzanian crop actually sell out, given that it has come late to the market? We're now almost at the end of November. The crop is, I think, is about 300,000 tons in. There's no real indication of any major problem in the crop other than its timing. Will it sell in time? That's a big question. We'll have a look at that later. Will the ending of the tariffs in the United States actually boost imports next year? Or will we see some renegotiation of contracts? But it happens. It happens quite a lot in cashews, as we know, and it especially happens between the US and Vietnam. Can China's import continue at this unbelievable speed? Will the trade peace or will trade agreements boost China's imports of other tree nuts, especially from the US? Would that affect the use of cashew nuts? I think that's a really interesting question. I've asked the question, is there a problem for Cambodia's 2026 crop? And the other question of many that comes to me is, will the regulators, and to a certain extent policymakers in West Africa, will they cave into some of the vested interests that are trying to influence their decisions for the 2026 season? Lots of questions, some interesting developments in a relatively stable market for once. So we saw kernel's prices in a relatively narrow range over several months now. On the news of the dropping of US tariffs, prices in Vietnam spiked up a little bit, but with the lack of real buyer reaction to that, And it's not a case of demand. Demand is good. It's a case of whether buyers are acting or not just now, particularly on forward contracts. Most of those price gains, 5 to 10 cents, have been lost, and we're back to where we were about 3 weeks ago. But demand signals still remain strong, market relatively stable. African cashew kernels from quality packers still maintaining significant premiums. Those premiums are based on quality, they're based on freight, especially for European buyers, and they're based on the idea of sustainability, which is also very important for European buyers. So premiums for African cashew kernels are about they're about quality, but they're also about managing risk. And that's really important for buyers in a market where demand is growing. If we look at RCN, yeah, we've seen prices shift up a little bit, about $50 higher. That seemed to come after the tariff announcement. I think that was a knee-jerk reaction. I don't see any real logical for that. If the tariff announcement from the US was to impact the market, we wouldn't really see that affect raw cashew nuts until next year, second quarter of next year. I do see, interestingly, that later shipment from East Africa means January, February, but later shipment is being offered at lower prices, and maybe that is a signal. The prices from Tanzania, looking at these levels, and it's a wide range, 1675 to 1750. These are offered prices, of course. That covers quality, it covers the different grades. It works in India, no doubt. I mean, it's not the best calculation that Indian processors will ever have seen, but it does work. But it doesn't work in the world market. It's very difficult to make money out of paying 1750 for sure, bringing it to Vietnam, processing it, and exporting the kernels. It's a very, very tight calculation. So the short-term future of raw cashew nut prices seems to me in question. So let's have a look at the crops, and let's particularly start by having a look at the auction. So in Tanzania, I'm sure most people are aware that the export of raw cashew nuts is controlled through an open auction conducted on the Tanzanian Mercantile Exchange. Daily auctions throughout the season. This year, the auction started on the 8th of November, I think, compared to last year where it started on the 11th of October. So it is a little bit late, but it's caught up. So this comparison is week by week on the auction. So week one in the blue column in 2024 means the week of the 11th of October. Week one for 2025 means the 8th of November, Saturday, the 8th of November. If we look at the total sales on a week-to-week basis, so week three compared to week three, 2024, 2025, volume-wise, well ahead, about 267,000 tons sold. There might be a slight variation on that because on the lists, it seems some of the product hasn't been paid for, but it's there or thereabouts. That's about 46% ahead of where it was after week three of last year. Now, that's not surprising. It's not surprising because there would have been some pent-up demand. Tanzanian raw cashew nuts are high quality. They come obviously at a time of year when supplies from elsewhere are limited, and therefore there is demand. Indian buyers particularly like Tanzanian RCN, but increasingly Vietnamese processors too are buying raw cashew nuts from Tanzania. 267,000 tons sold out of an estimated crop. It's not 700,000 tons, almost certain it's not 700,000 tons, as was the original forecast from the Cashew Board, but it could be in the region of 550,000 tons. So we're getting on toward half sold. What will happen next? Well, if we look at the trend in previous years, the volume sold over week four to week seven starts to shift downwards. The interest wanes a little bit and you get the sales spread over a longer period of time. So it wouldn't be surprising. I mean, it's not going to cool down the way it did last year, but it is going to cool down and we will see less volume move. How will that impact prices at auction is an interesting question, and how that will impact the overall market is also very interesting. It is difficult to reconcile all of the numbers in Tanzania. It's difficult to reconcile the estimate of the crop last year. I think the board's figure was 538,000 tons. It's difficult to reconcile that with the actual trade figures. So keep an eye on it, keep an eye on what's moving, and look for spikes. But let's just look at this. Now we're looking at the sales on dates. So last year it started on the 11th of October. This year, the 8th of November. The bars show the weekly total sales volume, and the line shows the cumulative sales volume. So this year, we look at a very sharp increase to get up to almost the same level. And if we're looking at this over a period of time, the first conclusion is that the delay, although it means the nuts are coming later to market, but the delay has effectively been caught up. So instead of this product arriving late November, it's probably arriving late December, significantly later than last year. Is that a problem? Well, we'll talk about that in a moment. By the 25th of November, by yesterday, sales were only about 25,000 tons less. And there's still 2 days to go of auctions this week. My week one's Friday to Friday. So more than likely, we're roughly, date-wise, we're at the same position in terms of the volume. But clearly, those nuts that were bought last year, mid-October, they're not going to be, that kind of availability is not going to be possible this year. So I think the first shipment is scheduled, maybe it's today, maybe it's tomorrow, but the first shipment is likely, according to the vessel schedules, to reach India, for example, toward the end of December. Now, there might be a few days leeway in that. It could be a little bit earlier. Let's have a look at the pricing. So here we're looking at the put together price. So we're looking at cost. The blue line is the auction price. So what I do is I work out the average price per week for a standard grade, and that's what you get in Tanzanian shillings. And you can see it's a little bit up and down, but that also varies with quality and location. Then we add on the on costs. So this is cost. This is not sales price. This is cost. And this is what we get. So we get a relatively narrow range of prices. So if we look at this, the highest put together price was $1,709. The lowest was $1,513. But again, that depends on price. It depends on location. So when we look then and we try to apply to this the pricing, and we compare the auction price during 2024 with the auction price in 2025, what we see is a gap of about 15%. It was higher throughout 2024. And remember, last year, the auction started very high. I mean, week one of last year versus week one of this year is a 36% price difference. That reflects a lot of things, but bear in mind, there was kind of a speculative bubble in the early part of the auction last year. Fortunately, we haven't seen that this year. So the gap in prices at auction in Tanzanian shillings, as from the first auction, it was 15%. By yesterday, it was down to 6%. So we're roughly in the same price range. If we look at the conversion, so the red line is the prices that were paid, put together last year. So what does put together price mean? It means the auction price plus the expenses charged by the auction for handling and delivery, plus the cost of loading, plus the cost of export tax, 15% or $160, whichever is higher, plus the freight, plus some expenses for finance. Don't forget you've got to pay within 5 days for your auction purchase, plus some costs of insurance and management. No trader's margin in this. So what we look at is that put together early on last year, prices were over $2,000. Everyone was really surprised at that. I remember talking on this event about it, and we were really trying to figure out what happened here. What happened was a lot of people paid a lot of money for something they shouldn't have paid for, and they paid too much for it. What's happening this year is a much more measured and cautious approach. And what we see is that comparing to last year in red to this year in black over the first 3 weeks, the average put together price is plus or minus 2.5% compared to last year. So by this time last year, we'd had several weeks of auction. Prices had come down to more workable levels, but this year they've started at those workable levels, a little bit higher than last year, but not much. If we look at that then and we consider market offers, so now we're looking again, the grey line is 2024 put together pricing. The black line, it's short because it's only 3 weeks, is this year's put together price. And the blue is the tracking the offers. And these are offered prices, not traded prices. These are the offered prices since the 11th of October of this year. So it's ranged from 1710 to 1750. We see a little bit of a markup in the last couple of weeks. Is that an effort to draw people in? I'm not sure. But one thing's for sure, there's not a great deal of room for negotiation in raw cashew nuts comparing the auction to the market offered price. So we would need to see the auction price come a little bit lower if prices are going to come down. And I mean, if you look at this, if you look at the difference between the offered price and the cost price, the margin for a trader in there is 6 to 8%. And I mean, that's not an excessive margin. By no means is it an excessive margin, particularly considering the risk organization finance incurred in this operation. So as we see it, the market is in line. So the market in Tanzania for raw cashew nuts is in line with the offered prices. We're not seeing a situation like last year where prices were perhaps artificially spiked and they came down. It is in line, or it is possible rather than being in line with the Indian kernels market. It is workable in that sense, but it's not workable in the international kernels market. So to what extent will the remaining Tanzanian raw material be dependent on sales to India, and to what extent will it be dependent on sales to Vietnam, may well determine the next stage in the auction. In other words, how much that price might fall, as it regularly does during November and December. And this year, don't forget, the auctions are scheduled to go on toward the end of January, I think even into the first week of February. So we may see lower prices, but we'll also see the quality tends to get a little bit lower, but not much. Tanzanian raw cashew nuts, generally speaking, are very high quality. What does this mean for processors in Tanzania? Well, it means that they're still going to struggle because these prices are really high for a local processor, but they have an opportunity to get some raw material in and maybe even to make some money this year, which has been a struggle for processors in Tanzania who could do with a little bit more support from the board and from the government. Let's have a look at some of this aspect of where does the money go in the Tanzanian cashew auction. And it's interesting if we take, so again, taking the auction price, so this is just average auction price, standard grade only, any undergrade is excluded, auction costs, loading and handling, freight, tax, export tax. A trader's margin, I've just put in 6%, $100. I guess you could trade for that, many wouldn't. Put it all together, about 22% of the cost and freight price is comprised of auction costs. So the auction costs that's the contribution. I think it's 457 Tanzanian shillings per kilo. That's the contribution that buyers must make to pay for expenses, development, levies, which hopefully is money well spent, and the general operation of the auction. Probably the part that's a bit questionable is that the auction price is less than 60% of the cost and freight value. There might be some room for argument in here. Freight for some might be a bit cheaper. Traders' margins might be a little bit different. They could be higher, they could be a little bit lower. But if we look at this auction price, 59% on that calculation ends up with the cooperative unions. From that, there are further deductions. So farmers will be receiving something lower than that. Now, are farmers getting better prices than they got in the past in Tanzania? Yes, they are. I mean, in the long-term perspective, definitely farmers are getting better prices than in the past. And we shouldn't forget that the auction was established in order to address the problem of, I suppose if we go back, it's not too strong a thing to say a little bit of price gouging by the export trade back, but we're talking 2006, 7, and the auction was established in 2008. But I think it's still, when we look at this, there is still a question. I mean, is this auction method, is this the most effective mechanism to, on the one hand, reward farmers for their work, for the risks they take, and on the other hand, is it the best way to efficiently deliver competitive costs and efficiency to processors in Tanzania, but also in Vietnam and India, which Tanzania still depends on as an outlet for its raw cashew nuts. And if we think about the pricing and we think about Southern Hemisphere crops, about 17% of the crop comes in worldwide between September and January. So effectively a tight supply position. We're talking about some of the best raw cashew nuts in the world. I think this is a valid question. I think it's a question we need to ask. And is there a better way to do this? And I wonder whether or not there is. And I suspect there is, but that's perhaps in a discussion for another day and something we might address. So let's look at the situation in Tanzania. First of all, intake into the warehouses is about 20% behind last year, or at least it was on Monday. The Cashew Board of Tanzania has revised its forecast from the rather optimistic 700,000 tons. I haven't seen a figure, but I have seen many trade figures, and people are talking, well, the lowest figure I've seen is 450,000 tons. That's better than last year on the lowest figure. But on the popular figure is around 550,000 tons. How much science is behind that? Well, probably not a lot. People are looking at what they saw last year versus what they see this year. They're taking into account that it's a little bit later. And, there's a lot of guesswork in this, let's be honest about it. But I wouldn't be surprised if that figure is coming in about right. Auction sales have caught up. That's been pretty efficient. Sale of the product, prices have been accepted, it's worked out. Prices are steady up to now on good demand, and that little spike given by the removal of US tariffs on cashew kernels. But it does mean that the first arrivals at destination for processing will be towards the end of December, based on those shipments going this week. That could be a little earlier. More likely it's a little later, but that's what we're looking at. And that's a little bit later than it would have been in previous years. How does that affect processors? Well, there's the question. Will processors keep buying material that they won't have for processing until January, even out as far as mid-February? And that's a big question for them. And, I think the answer is, will they keep buying this at prices above $1,700? The answer to that, for me, is no, they will not. Because once we get out into January, February, for Vietnamese buyers, You're looking at the Cambodian crop coming in, again, good quality crop. Some of it's early in a normal year, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So Indian buyers, on the other hand, maybe a tighter supply situation in India. Will they pursue this? I don't know. Will buyers continue to follow the market at the current prices? Are we past the situation where that pent-up demand caused by the delayed harvest in Tanzania has been met and prices are going to slip back a little bit? And they often do at this time of year. But a bigger question, I wouldn't be concerned that prices will drift down. That's to be expected. But a bigger question is it possible that some of this crop, and I'm thinking that the crop is 550,000 tons, that some of that remains unsold? And I'm not sure, but maybe it would be a good idea to consider supporting local processors to make sure that the entire crop gets moved. Having this product in warehouses once the West African, Cambodian, and Indian crops start is not a good idea. And that remains challenging. Now, it may sell. Let's hope it does. But it's got to be a question that needs to be asked, that there is this possibility that some of the Tanzanian crop remains unsold. What would that do? Well, it wouldn't be very good for balance of payments in Tanzania. It wouldn't be an ideal situation for farmers because the payment to farmers is linked to the sale at auction. And it wouldn't be a good idea for the general supply-demand balance over the coming year. How does this happen in a year of record demand? Well, it happens because not only have we had record demand, but we've also had record supply. And a crop of 550,000 tons would be a record crop in Tanzania, to go with record crops all around the world. So we're seeing tremendous growth in our business. We're seeing tremendous growth in demand, new markets opening, more and more people looking at cashew kernels in all kinds of ways, but we're also seeing production rising quickly. Where else is production rising? Well, it's also rising in Mozambique. So in northern Mozambique, the harvest is now ongoing. It's just about started in the central area, and we'll see the southern regions, which are much lower in volume, we'll see those kick off in December. So you have a situation now where we've seen an early spike in prices. So we got a minimum farm gate price of 45 Medi-Cal per kilo, about $715 per ton. Exports are banned until processors have bought what they need. That's not as much volume as it might have been before, but I think we're talking about somewhere in the region of 45, 50,000 tons in total. Those exports then can start usually during December. There's been quite a spike in interest early in the season. As the Tanzanian crop was delayed, you have a crop beginning in Mozambique, but you're not allowed to export it. You know what happens in cashews in that situation. So we've seen some smuggling and we've seen some illegal trade. And in essence, that caused prices to spike. So we saw a significant rise in prices, about 30%, momentarily from 45 to 60 Medi-Cal. That's $950, but it's now seems to have eased back again. So that situation, a little bit nerve-wracking for local processors to begin with, but it seems to be easing now. Crop estimate unchanged. So we've got this discussion in Mozambique, and if you look at the figures on the screen, it doesn't add up to the IAM estimate of 200,000 tons. So we have this discussion between trade and the official bodies, one saying the crop is around about 200,000 tons, others saying it's more likely 120,000 tons. That needs to be resolved. What we can say is it looks like a pretty decent crop in Mozambique this year. Some recent rains they'll hinder drying and they'll hinder movement of raw cashew nuts, but I don't think that they're enough to consider that we should revise our crop estimates. So still looking good. I personally think it's around the 120,000 ton figure. I just can't see the 200,000 tons. I'd love to be proven wrong on that one. So offers in the market, I hear custom freight prices 1450 to 1500. That spiked up by about $50. Earlier we saw trade at 1425. Obviously that trade's speculative because you can't export at this moment. These prices, these custom freight prices look a little bit high if we're talking about the minimum farm gate price around 45. Of course, they don't look so high. They actually look low if we're looking at the other price, 60. So that will probably adjust in the coming weeks. So Mozambique, again, looks like a good crop. And overall, East Africa is on the up. Greater production, better management of the overall sector, improved interventions at government level, and it looks like we're going to see an increase in production. We may also see an increase in processing, but that appears to be a much more complex investment challenge than it was in West Africa over the last 10 years or so. Needs to be kept an eye on. These figures could continue to go up, and we're looking at good quality raw material available in the market at a very interesting time of year, starting in September, going through until January. I also wanted to mention currency. And I think it's part of the explanation as to why we're seeing the prices that we are seeing. The Tanzanian shilling. So here's the Tanzanian shilling against the US dollar over a period of a year. It starts on the 25th of November 2024, and you can see there was a decline and a rise again, and where we are now. So the Tanzanian shilling, and lower is higher in this case, the Tanzanian shilling is about 6.5% stronger than it was last year. And this is down to exports of gold, to reduced imports. And this, of course, increases the cost of importing from Tanzania. Flip side of that is the Indian rupee and the value of the Indian rupee. So for comparison purposes, here is the chart, same period, Indian rupee from 11th of November 2024 until yesterday. And what you can see is it's taken something of a dive, a little bit of volatility, but it's about 5.7% weaker against the dollar. So on the one hand, you have the strength of the Tanzanian shilling making it more expensive to buy imports from Tanzania in dollars. And on the other hand, you have the weakness of the Indian rupee, which is making it more expensive to import anything really, but especially anything denominated in US dollars. So this is a key factor, and this is a factor which has influenced the market over the last few weeks, and it could continue. So if the rupee were to weaken further, it will make imports for Indian processors more expensive, which means that the auction price should reflect that. It's also interesting just to highlight at this moment that the dependence of the Indian cashew consumer, and India is the biggest consumer in the world, in excess of 350,000 tons, some say it's 400,000 tons of cashew kernels. It's interesting to reflect that India still imports about 60% of its raw material to process. It's a big industry in India, and it's dependent, not entirely, but it's significantly dependent on imports, and that hasn't changed for a long time. So what other factors can influence our situation? Well, let's have a look at Vietnam. Let's have a look at what's changed in the balance sheet. If you're with us regularly, you will have seen this before, and you will have seen the situation. So what we're looking at is very strong imports into Vietnam. It's strongly up on last year. That's on the RCN side. On Burma kernels, much more difficult to get an idea what the number is. This is my guesstimate. And that's an RCN figure, of course. Exports and domestic, record exports. We know that really impressive export development driven by China, driven by Europe, driven by West Asia. This is pretty spectacular this year, particularly when you look at the US market, and we will look at the US market in a moment. But particularly when you look at the developments in the US market, it is pretty spectacular. I'm thinking about 150,000 tons of float. That probably includes some of the Tanzanian purchases. That would give a balance of about 1.5 months of stock based on the processing volume of this year. So if we take that and we bring that through to the next crop and the Vietnamese crop, the Cambodian crop, that would mean Vietnam needs an additional 300,000 tons if exports keep the same pace. So it's a relatively tight situation, but it's by no means unusual. It's not a critical situation, and I think Vietnamese processors would probably be happy to have a tight stocking situation at the end of the season, provided the crop in Cambodia and in Vietnam comes in well and comes in on time. So it's tight, but it's not critical. There's no reason to think that this should increase volatility in the market. Let's have a look at that situation in Cambodia. So it's been really a landmark here. Vietnam's imported officially on this custom statistics 965,000 tons from Cambodia. That would mean that the crop is approaching 1 million tons, which is definitely going to happen. The Cambodia will reach 1 million tons. It may have reached 1 million tons this year. We don't know yet exactly how much is left in Cambodia. We know it's not much. It's less than 10,000 tons. And we know that the processing there has been struggling a little bit this year. That'll change, but this year has been a struggle for processors. Really, the impact on Cambodian production of climate change has been covered over by the expansion in the area and the coming online and maturing of so many new trees. But climate extremes, particularly high temperatures, and to a certain extent heavy rains over the last 3 to 5 years have impacted production on particular crops. We're not sure exactly how that impact has been on cashews. There are incidences of severe damage to yields, but we're trying to balance new production coming online with damage to yield. Generally speaking, we've had very good crops. This year, looking at the weather, and this is from the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia University, and that's published by the World Food Programme. It looks like the weather forecast after a very wet early October, which then dried up again, more rains in November. Again, that's begun to dry up. And what we need now is some nice dry sunshine, not too hot, maybe a few showers during flowering. And looking at it now, the forecast for that period, November, December, January, looks pretty conducive to that. They're saying it will be a little bit wetter than normal, but you can see in this chart on the left, so here's Vietnam and Cambodia, and you can see the lighter green colors. The lighter green color means above normal, but not critically above normal. If we look at temperatures, the seasonal temperature forecast is a little bit below normal. So again, we're looking at low temperatures. Now this, by the way, this doesn't mean it's cold in Cambodia. Let's be clear. It just means it's a little bit below normal. So temperatures around this time of year, around about 30 plus, and they're talking about it being a little bit lower. And that's interesting because look at the area, Vietnam and Cambodia, big production areas for cashew nuts, lower temperatures. We can't say what it means. It's only a forecast, but it is asking a question and it needs to be kept a close eye on. What about India? Well, so I've updated the Indian situation. We do this once a month, and we had a look at the scenario. And right now, India looks pretty well supplied, despite some re-export of raw cashew nuts, which has now stopped. Steady demand in India. Tanzania, well, I think most of the product that's been sold, we said 267,000 tons sold by the end of this week. That'll probably be 290. I'm guessing most of that's going to India, or will end up in India, given its price. Later on, we might see Vietnamese buyers more interested as prices ease a little bit. Let's say most of that is likely to go to India. Imports this year very strong. We're estimating 1.25 million tons. Okay, there's been some re-export, about 100,000 tons is my guess. That could be more or less, but I think it's a reasonable number. That would mean that the current closing stock is around 330,000 tons. Now that's right across the country. So that doesn't mean there's warehouses with 330,000 tons stacked up. It means that between all the imports, all the use, all the exports, there should be about that amount left. That would mean that taking into account demand, typical monthly demand over the first quarter of 2026, India's needs are relatively low. If India was to continue the kind of volume of imports that we saw earlier in the year, India could end up with a high stocking level at the end of the year. And I think perhaps that's the reason that we're seeing a more conservative approach at the auction. It's also the reason why I call this Deja Vu 2022, because that's a year when India ended up with essentially excess stock at the end of the year. So the conclusion is that the buying in the early auctions, and we saw how active the early auctions were in that catch up, that's allowed catch up. Those shipments will arrive well into December, into late December. And on that basis, is there any reason why Indian buyers should be aggressive in the raw cashew nut market? I would suggest no. There's no reason at all that they should be aggressive in the raw cashew nut market. That doesn't mean everyone's got stock. It often depends on who owns the stock and how strong they are. It also depends on any spike in demand, but demand looks relatively normal at the moment in terms of its patterns. And I think by the time the stock starts to arrive, the Tanzanian nuts arrive, there's nothing like an arriving shipment to calm your interest in buying, or particularly paying for an arriving shipment. Suggests to me India probably has enough material that it can buy carefully. I think Vietnam is the same. So this could mean, going back to the discussion, something left unsold in Tanzania. It could slow the entry of Indian and Vietnamese buyers to the West African market. There could be a little bit of stock left over in Tanzania, possibly too in Mozambique if the crop were as big as the IAM says it could be. And that would mean a very slow start to the 2026 season. And that is something that perhaps the regulators might take into account when they're planning the season. It's something that traders and farmers should consider, but also will have an impact on sourcing for West African processors at the beginning of 2026. So back to East Africa, back to the Southern Hemisphere, we've revised our crop estimate down by about 100,000 tons. That's based on a lower, that's particularly the high estimate. So we did the high and low, and particularly the high estimate is dropped down back. That's based on expectations of a little bit lower in Tanzania than originally forecast, perhaps a little bit lower in Mozambique, but not too much. Again, let's be clear, Southern Hemisphere crop this year, based on East Africa primarily, will be more than likely a record crop. So where do we go from there? Well, let's go to North America. Let's have a look at US tariffs. So it would be easy to assume that the removal of import tariffs on cashew kernels would lead to an immediate boom in demand for imports in the United States. We haven't seen that so far, and I think we're unlikely to see it. Put this into context. This year, January to August, and I'm using US import figures, they are reflected probably even more by the Vietnamese export figures, but let's use the official US import figures. Total imports down by about 19%. So we see the two trends. These brownish color bars, those are the natural bulk cashew kernels imports. Those are the 50 pound facts, 700 per container that we're all very familiar with. The blue line is processed, mainly roasted, mainly bulk imported kernels under a different tariff heading. And that's been growing, as you can see, significantly. It's almost exclusively from Vietnam, a little bit from Thailand, a little bit from one or two other places, but mainly from Vietnam. And that figure is actually doing quite well this year. It's up by 12%. But overall, if we take the natural down 27%, that's the lowest January to August imports since 2009. The figure for August was the lowest month for I don't know how many years. We have to go a long way back to find a lower month than the imports during August. Overall impact is imports down 19%. That's not going to change. It's not going to change this year. We're not going to see a reversal in that figure. Ending tariffs doesn't turn the tap back on right away. So if we look at this, so first of all, let's consider last year's imports were huge. Last year's imports were, I think, 23% up on the previous year. Record year, no real justification for that in demand. So if we take that stock, the record import, and we kind of transfer it over onto this year, you can see what it does. It would bring January to August up above January to August of 2024. It would mean that probably, if we evened out these figures, that the 2023 figure, 2024 figure, 2025 figure would all be the same. So what we're talking about here is a difference in timing, and that difference in timing has been driven by the fear initially, then the reality of the imposition of import tariffs, and now we've seen those removed. So record imports last year, retail sales in the United States, and I only have the sales for supermarkets, not other outlets, were up by about 7%. That would leave us with a difference, and these are rough numbers, a difference of about 16%. Shift that 16% from 2024 into 2025, and it does suggest that actually the trends in nut consumption or cashew consumption, we know nut consumption is strong, are not as bad as we might see reflected in the import figures. Overall, US retail sales in this segment are up by just over 4% up to September. Now, I can't extract for cashew nuts at this time, but overall, when I look at this, I think what we've got is a situation where we have a disruption rather than a fundamental change, a disruption that will change back to an earlier situation through the removal of the tariffs. That should mean that next year we will see a more regular import pattern from the United States. It won't happen immediately. That's for certain. It's going to take a certain amount of adjustment, but we will see, I think we will see US buyers return to the market when the opportunity presents itself next year. So I guess they're watching the market, they're watching the progress on the crops, and they'll be very interested to see West Africa positive news, and the question mark over Cambodia at this moment in time. That's where we stand market-wise. We're going to have a look at policy. We're going to have a look at policy in Africa for a few moments, just keeping an eye on the timing. And let's just run through a few things here. Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, slow payment or no payment of the processors subsidy is definitely causing cash flow problems for processors. It impacts weaker processors that it was meant to help, of course. It impacts them more than it does bigger, larger processors, it is definitely causing disruption and it's causing a consolidation in the industry. I do not know when that will change. I do not know if it will change. We do know that the subsidy is being phased out over a longer period of time. In Nigeria, I'm going to talk about Nigeria a little bit in a moment because I think it's an indicator of some of the volatility in policy across Africa. Push for a ban on exports or control on the exports of raw cashew nuts, and this is drawing objections from farmers, and who can blame them for that? Come back to that in a moment. Meantime, in Ghana, from an observer's point of view, this is somewhat exasperating. For some years, the tree crops development legislation was put in place in 2023, and since then, very little seems to have happened on cashews. There's a minimum price, there's registration, but nothing else. Focus now appears to be on reorganization of the organizations, not really on regulation for the time being. The lead body, the Tree Crops Development Authority, has been through a change of leadership that seems to be taking a long time to bed in. There are rumors that an export window will be introduced. I would have to ask for whose benefit. We don't see many processors in Ghana just yet. We do see an enormous transit trade through the country, and that's really positive. I think the export window would damage farmers. I think it would hit the farm gate price. Much better if the processors could be supported, developed, are allowed to build their supply chains. In Benin, still no real concrete remarks on the change, if any, in the supply chain operation for the coming year. As you know, Benin has banned the export of raw cashew nuts. That ban is not at all effective, as we'll see in a moment, on the Nigerian numbers. And if you look at the numbers imported from surrounding countries to Vietnam or to India, it's really surprising figures. So clearly the Benin crop is going abroad. Mozambique, well, it's interesting. We're now seeing a new sector support and development plan. I've had a quick look at it. I'm really encouraged by it, and I think that there may be good ideas. But as always, in policy and regulation, everywhere, not just in African countries, the problem is often in the implementation. So a good plan doesn't necessarily mean big changes, but the plan is a good plan. And it'll be interesting to see how that moves forward. I wanted to look at Nigeria, and a recent article drew my attention, an article in the Nigerian Tribune, an online news content site. So this talk about an export ban, and it's not just cashews, but here we have the chairman of the JADEC group of companies suggesting to the federal government that they should rethink any ideas to ban the export of raw cashew nuts. And I think he's so right. At the same time, almost at the same time, we see a new MOU between the Nigerian cashew sector and the Vietnamese cashew sector. Quite a good idea, in my opinion, a really constructive thing, an MOU for technology transfer and other cooperation. But of course, that would be completely contradictory to a ban on the export of raw cashew nuts. So it's very confusing. You get these contradictory signals in Nigeria, in Ghana, even in Cote d'Ivoire, who's like the most successful cashew country of the last decade. How do you pick your way through this? If you look at the numbers, and we talk about banning raw cashew nut exports, if we look at import side, between January and October, Vietnam imported 262,000 tons that were designated Nigerian origin. India, according to the Indian government website, imported 172,000 tons. That's 434,000 tons. That's way above the production of Nigeria. So clearly a ban on the export of raw cashew nuts wouldn't really make sense. What it would do is it would reduce farm gate prices. Reducing farm gate prices means production would react. Production would react, would make the position of the industry more difficult in the future. Meantime, the trade in cashew kernels doing well in the European market. 2,299 tons of Nigerian cashew kernels imported by August. That's an increase on last year. US, not surprisingly, given the situation, US imports are down only 349 tons imported to the US from Nigeria between January and August this year. I don't have the Vietnam cashew kernel figures imports from Nigeria for 2024. Never mind 2025, they're just really difficult to extract. If you look at Nigerian trade figures, clearly raw cashew nuts and kernels are mixed in together when you look at values. If I go back and look at imports, it looks like Vietnam imported about 1,300 tons of what are probably Burma kernels, well, which are certainly Burma kernels in 2023, and the figure's probably gone up since then. So in Nigeria, we've got a situation where processing plants are struggling, but I don't think they're struggling because of the export of raw cashew nuts. I think they're struggling because of the three M's. The three M's: management, money, marketing. The ability to manage the existing factories that have been built, the ability for several businesses to fund their operations with working capital, and their ability to market. Whether they can reach the right markets with the right product to make the kind of prices that will sustain their businesses. So processing plants may complain that they're struggling, and I don't doubt it, but it's not because of the cost of raw cashew nuts. If we look at the cross-border trade, if we look at 434,000 tons running through the country, produced in it, and imported from neighboring countries, this cross-border trade is an opportunity for processors. And we see increasing production. So is a raw cashew nut export ban the answer? Definitely not. And this is what I mean earlier when I said, will policy makers and regulators in African countries bow to vested interests? It's clear that a ban on RCN export would make processing more profitable, but it would make farming less profitable. It's clearly a move by a vested interest, in my view. So what's the outlook? Let's have a quick look at what we're expecting to see over the coming weeks. I think raw cashew nut stocks definitely tightening, but so they should be in November, but they're adequate. The supply probably exceeds the need, but it's not going to make it to the market on time to dampen prices too much. Kernels buyers continue to wait. Crop forecasts downgraded a little bit. That can change. East African crops not as big as hoped, but certainly records. That certainly looks likely. The Tanzanian auction, really interesting time, relatively well managed, I think. Speculation didn't emerge. Careful approach is likely in the coming weeks. I wouldn't be speculating in that market right now. Cashew kernels demand, it's great to say it and say it again, is breaking records just about everywhere. Key factors to look out for: the weather in Cambodia is a factor. I don't think we're looking at a major problem, but we need to keep a close eye on that. West Africa looks good. As I was saying earlier, some people are saying that crop might be a little bit early, and those are people on the ground. So this is people who are working in the sector. Definitely coming into West African cashew season, big challenges for regulators: how to set reference prices, whether to introduce export windows, how to encourage production, how to manage transit trade, how to undo some of the very difficult to implement measures that have been put in place in recent years. End to the year, I think probably relatively stable market. I do think RCN prices need to slip down a little bit. Kernels can stay relatively steady. Don't expect any big shocks. Calm end to the year. Well, anyone who says there's going to be a calm end to anything in the cashew business is taking a risk, but that's what I think. Thanks very much indeed for listening. That's about an hour. We've hit a lot of different subjects. We've looked at East Africa. We've looked at the market in general. We've looked at the supply balance in Vietnam and in India. We've talked about the impact of tariffs. We've had a quick look at policy and emerging policy for the coming 2026 season. And let's hand back to Stella and see if there are any comments or questions. Stella.
Hi, Jim. Thank you very much. Yes, I have a couple of questions here. What volume of Tanzanian raw cashew nuts do you believe is at real risk of remaining unsold if cluster arrives into January, February 2026?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, if we consider what was sold last year and what's expected this year, and if we factor in the lateness of the crop, you could be looking at something in the region of 75 to 100,000 tons. Now, at a price that'll sell, because it is high quality. So it's a question really of whether buyers will wait and look to buy it at a lower price. But if we were to talk at today's prices, I think that's what could be left. I'm not saying will be left, I'm saying what could be left. Stella.
Jim, which West African country poses the highest regulatory risk for 2026 regarding their policies?
Okay, well, regulatory risk. So we can look at that two ways. We can look at countries with high levels of regulation, like Ivory Coast, for example, and how they might change those regulations. Or we can look at countries with low levels of regulation, like Nigeria, and how they might introduce new measures. In my opinion, there's a greater risk that the new countries will introduce measures which don't work or which are inappropriate or have unintended consequences. So I'm not going to mention a single country as having the greatest risk. That wouldn't be right. But I think what I will say is that countries that currently have low levels of regulation, the temptation to introduce new regulatory measures or policies could well be more damaging than countries that already have regulations in place, changing or tinkering with their current regimes. So look out for news from those countries that have low levels of regulation currently. That's a great question, but it's we could talk about that for hours. Stella, back to you.
I have a question back to Tanzania regarding the Tanzania crop. Sri Rama says that they're expecting 550 for the 2025 season. What's the number for the 2024 season? How much increase is expected now?
That would be an increase of about 100,000 tons. And that is the tracking of trade. Now, if we take the official figure is a higher figure. I think it was 538,000 tons. I might be corrected a little bit on that, but it was in that range. That figure is very difficult to trace in terms of trade. It's very difficult to trace if you take exports, if you take processing, if you combine all those figures, it's quite difficult to justify that number. So I think that probably we're looking at an increase on the current forecast of about 100,000 tons. That's a big increase, of course. And this is partially where the concern as to whether it will go to market comes from. Stella.
Next webinar will be the last for this year. What should we expect during GME on December 10th?
Stella, I lost you for a moment. Could you repeat that?
Can you hear me, Jim?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I was saying that the next webinar will be the last for this year. What should we expect during GME on December 10th?
Well, I think what I have in mind and what we've discussed with yourselves at ACA is let's have a bit of a review of the year on December 10th, when we'll have a look at what's happened, we'll review the crops, we'll review the demand over the year and the major events to try and give ourselves some perspective and set ourselves up for taking a quick look at what we might expect in 2026. That's a couple of weeks away. That's going to be an interesting one. I better get working on that right away, because looking back over an entire year in an hour is not an easy task. But yeah, I'm looking forward to that. I hope everyone will join us again. The attendance at the webinar has been slowly going up during this year, which is great. And thanks to everyone who has joined us. And thanks to everyone who's asked questions and contacted me or the ACA afterwards. It's much appreciated. And I'm looking forward to that event on the 10th of December, when we can have a nice discussion on 2025 and what's coming in 2026.
Thank you very much, Jim. We are also saying thank you to the European Union, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, the GIZ Move Cashew Project, the Sustainable Nut Initiative, and the Cashew Club that are making this webinar possible. A big thank you also to the team behind the scenes, the IT team, the interpreters, and everyone else. You can find all the Global Market Encounter sessions with Jim Fitzpatrick on the ACA YouTube channel at African Cashew A. And until the 10th of December, enjoy the networking session. Bye.
Thanks, Stella. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.
Focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. MEA is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full